EDH deck building. I am your host, Demo, and these are some crazy black enchantments that may or may not work well in the Commander format. This is actually sort of a series that I incidentally started. About a year ago, I made a video about crazy red enchantments that in the Commander format can be particularly good. A lot of them were really wacky. I was just planning on doing the red enchantment video and nothing else because I just happened to come across all these really wacky red enchantments that are doing really bizarre things, but could actually be good. Like, can we find ways to use these in the Commander format? I ended up doing another one a few months later on blue enchantments. So I've done red and blue enchantments now, and I decided why not continue on, and now I'm going to do some wacky, crazy black enchantments. So first of all, these are enchantments that a lot of players might never have heard of. They are very old, most of them. There's also a lot here that I picked out that are doing very different things that you would normally see in black, or they're doing very specific things that maybe black might need help with. And I'm going to give you an example of what I'm talking about here, starting out with Hunting Wind, 3 and a black enchantment. Whenever an artifact becomes tapped, or a player activates an artifact's ability without a tap in its activation cost, Hunting Wind deals 1 damage to that artifact's controller. So obviously, I'm reading the errata text, very different from the original text. This is a very old card, originally from Antiquities. I have never seen it before until I started doing the research for this video. Even when I was going through looking at cards for my 10 cards videos, I never came across this. It is pretty interesting. It is obviously hating on artifacts. Now, the really weird wording here sort of confuses me a little bit. Whenever an artifact becomes tapped, or a player activates an artifact ability without a tap in its activation cost, Hunting Wind deals damage to them. So that might make people think that an artifact that doesn't have a tap in its activation will not work here, but it's covering both of those scenarios, right? The first scenario is whenever an artifact becomes tapped, so whenever it becomes tapped in any way. So if your opponent attacks you with their Blightsteel Colossus, that is an artifact becoming tapped. Haunting Winds is going to deal 1 damage to them. If you tap an artifact to activate its ability, like say a Mana Rock, that is an artifact becoming tapped, right? Someone taps their Soul Ring for mana. That's an artifact becoming tapped. They're going to take 1 damage from this. That seems pretty good. Or if a player activates an artifact's ability without a tap in it, it also is going to deal 1 damage to them, right? So if they have some artifact with a, say, repeatable activation, like an Ashnod's Altar, for example, that is an activation cost that doesn't have a tap ability in it. So this really does fit a lot of scenarios. And of course, the scenario that I think it's best at is against treasure tokens. Treasure tokens are artifacts that you have to tap in order to use them. So every time your opponent is going off, sacking all those treasure tokens, they're going to have to tap them to activate them. So they're going to be taking 1 damage. This is actually a really good card against a heavy artifact theme. Very unique and interesting. And of course, black is not exactly famous for hating on the whole artifact thing. So this is one of the rare cards that does that. Another one of the very rare cards that hates on the artifact theme is Gate to Phyrexia, black and a black enchantment. Sacrifice a creature, destroy target artifact. Activate only during your upkeep and only once each turn. So this is very unique because there's only a couple of cards in the entire game of Magic that are mono black that can destroy artifacts. And this is one of them, of course, doing it in the typical black fashion of sacrificing a creature. You can only do it once per turn, and you have to do it on your upkeep just because that's the way they used to print these cards, is you did stuff on your upkeep. But this is a way, if you're in a black deck, particularly a mono black deck, where you don't mind sacrificing your creatures and you find that you're running into issues dealing with your opponent's artifacts, because of course black doesn't really do that at all, this is an option for you that you might not know existed, right? It's not super goofy and weird and crazy. It is just very unique in black, which is why I'm mentioning it. Next up, we got Yawgmoth's Agenda. This is a very interesting card that I'm actually kind of surprised doesn't see more play in the Commander format. 3 black, black enchantment. You can't cast more than 1 spell each turn. That's not super fantastic. So on your turn, you can cast 1 spell, but of course on your opponent's turns, you can cast 1 spell on everyone else's turn as well. That's not super great. However, the upside here is massive. You may play lands and cast spells from your graveyard. That's pretty good, right? So even if you're just using this for the land thing, right? I can cast a spell from my graveyard on my turn, but I can also play a land from my graveyard on my turn as well. So if you're in any deck, like maybe a Tormod deck where, hey, playing lands from my graveyard, that actually gets me a zombie token, seems like a pretty good fit there, right? And also, of course, casting spells from your graveyard is incredible because you now are turning your graveyard into your hand. Now, of course, the downside again here is if a card would be put into your graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So you can't just keep going off like crazy here. But later in a game, I got like 40, 50 cards in my graveyard. I can slap this guy down and just start going to town. Again, it sort of turns your graveyard into your hand. I'm really surprised this card doesn't see more play in the format. I actually included it in my Egon deck, the most death-defying deck I ever created, because that deck was basically built around the idea of playing out of the graveyard, so it was a great fit there. That's the only place that I've ever put it or ever actually seen it in a Commander game. Next up, we have Endless Whispers. Very unique, very wacky, crazy card in a Commander game. If anyone's ever seen this thing in action, 2 black enchantment. Each creature has, when this creature dies, choose target opponent. That player puts this card from its owner's graveyard onto the battlefield under their control at the beginning of the next end step. Man, a Commander game gets so wild and wacky and crazy when this card is in play. Like I said in my last wrong card sort of rules clarification video, whenever you see this phrasing with the quotes on it, basically what you do is you imagine those words are printed on every creature, right? This is every creature in play. Every single creature on the battlefield in your Commander game is going to have these words printed on it. Whenever it dies, it goes to the graveyard, and then you're going to choose an opponent to donate that creature to. Now, if you're in any theme where you want to be donating stuff, I mean, I incorrectly talked about how black doesn't really have a lot of donate effects. It doesn't, but this is one that I sort of had forgotten about. This is a way to donate nasty stuff to your opponents if you want to. The combo here is with Phage. Again, Phage is another creature that combos with a lot of stuff. Great combo with Endless Whispers because, of course, you sacrifice your Phage, it goes to the graveyard, and then you will choose an opponent to give it to. When it enters the battlefield, of course, it wasn't cast, and that player will lose the game. Nifty little combo there, but there is a lot of really wacky, interesting things that you can do with this card. It's a crazy one for sure. See if it fits in any of your decks. Next up, we got Koskin Falls, a card that I have talked about on my channel before on my World Enchantments video, because this is a World Enchantment, and I'm not going to get into the particulars of how World Enchantments work. You can check out that video where I explain it. 2 black, World Enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice Koskin Falls unless you tap an untapped creature you control. That's not that hard to do. Creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature they control. That's attacking you. So I'm sure we've all heard that wording before, right? It is a ghostly prison, essentially the same card. Who'd have thought that this ability was originally printed in black, right? This is a black pillow fort effect, which you don't see much. Again, that's why I'm mentioning it, because it is very rare in mono black, and people might be looking for effects like that in this color. It's particularly good, I think, in a King Makar deck if you have one of those, because of course your commander has that inspired ability and you want to be tapping it, right? So it works nicely there because you can just use your Koskin Falls to tap down your commander. Next up, Season of the Witch, sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum. Again, we're doing all these weird, wacky things that you don't normally see in black, and this is a really interesting one. Black. So 3 black mana enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice Season of the Witch unless you pay 2 life. That's not very difficult, right? No mana required here. You just got to pay 2 life. Easy to do. If at any point you don't want to pay the life anymore, you can just stop doing so and sacrifice it. At the beginning of your end step, destroy all untapped creatures that didn't attack this turn, except for the creatures that couldn't attack. Very weird card that you never see in black, right? Again, this is the opposite of Koskin Falls, where now we're encouraging players to attack. So if you're in a black deck where you are wanting people to attack, maybe you're going to be attacking all the time. Maybe a Carter Doomscourge deck would be a good fit for this card, where you want your opponents to attack, right? Because at the beginning of every end step, any creature that didn't attack will get destroyed as long as it is not tapped. tap. That's really putting some heavy pressure on your opponents to attack. And a really interesting thing with this card, again, the wording is very specific here. At the beginning of every end step, regardless of whose turn it is, that second ability is going to trigger. When it resolves, every creature that could have been declared as an attacker during the declare attacker step but wasn't will be destroyed. And I think a really interesting fit for this is a steel theme. If you are in, say, a black-red steel deck, what an interesting fit this is, because what you can do is cast like an Act of Treason, right? Act of Treason says gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap that creature, it gains haste. So if a creature has haste, that means it's able to attack. So if I steal my opponent's commander, instead of attacking with it, I can just let it sit there. So on my declare attacker step, I forego attacking with it. I don't have to. It has haste, so it is able to attack, but I choose not to, because then at the beginning of my end step, my Season of the Witch will trigger, and it'll look for all the creatures that I have that were able to attack but didn't, and the creature I stole was able to attack but didn't, so it will get destroyed before it has the opportunity to go back under my opponent's control. That's a very interesting fit for a card like this, I think. Anyone out there with a Rakdos, maybe Grixis steel creature theme? This might be a really interesting fit for you. Another really interesting black enchantment that, again, you do not see this kind of thing in black a lot, maybe a little bit, but not a ton. Desolation, 1 black enchantment. At the beginning of each end step, each player who tapped a land for mana this turn sacrifices a land. Desolation deals 2 damage to each player who sacrificed a plains this way, so specifically hating on those white players. And they used to do this all the time in Magic. They don't really do it at all anymore. In fact, I'm pretty sure they abandoned this idea entirely of hating on certain colors, but it was very, very common back in the day. But other than just hating on the people who are playing plains, this is just hating on lands entirely, again, which you really don't see in black. If you're looking for an effect like this, a black effect that is sort of hating on lands, forcing your opponents to sacrifice lands. Again, if you're in that lands theme, this might be an interesting fit, right? Because you don't care if your lands go to the graveyard. I mean, obviously people don't like land destruction or land sacrifice, that kind of stuff. It's just 1 land per turn. And I think if it fits the strategy of your deck, I would have no problem with someone playing this in a commander game. I think it's a great fit in a theme like that. Next up, a card that maybe commander players would be a little more familiar with, Lethal Vapors. 2 black enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield, destroy it. Oh boy, that is an incredibly powerful effect, but of course it has this not often seen 0 ability, destroy lethal vapors. You skip your next turn, any player may activate this ability. So I saw this in commander games, not a lot, but from time to time when I first started playing. Haven't seen it in a long time. It is a great way if you were just hating on creatures. Again, this fits in the Pillow Fort theme again, sort of, because of course, if you don't want to get attacked, it's a lot easier to do so if no one has creatures. And the really fun thing about this in a commander game, of course, anyone can activate the ability. You're obviously not going to do so, but the guy who is playing a very heavy creature theme or just wants to cast their commander and not have it destroyed has to skip their next turn in order to do so. So really powerful effect, but also a really sort of political ability that fits really interesting in a lot of commander games. Another card that is very weird and goofy and has a similar sort of effect, Volros Dungeon, 2 black enchantment. Pay 5 life, destroy Volros Dungeon. Any player may activate this ability, but only during their turn. So again, can be destroyed by any player by only paying 5 life, but they can only do so on their turn, which is significant because it has a pretty powerful ability here, I think. Discard a card, target player puts a card from their hand on top of their library, activate only as a sorcery. So when you play this card, of course, the ability you're using here doesn't require any mana, so it's very easy for you to start using it right away. And I just think this is a great include in any deck where you plan on having a really full hand and maybe you want to be discarding either of those fits. Like I've just drawn a ton of cards with maybe my Eldritch Pact or something like that, right? I Eldritch Pact, draw 30 cards, play my Volros Dungeon, and then I can very easily discard like 20 of those cards to make all of my opponents put their hands back on top of their library, which a lot of times can be even worse than discarding because, of course, for the next however many turns, they're just going to be drawing those cards again, right? They can't do anything about it because it's your turn and only players can activate that destroy ability on their turn. So it is a pretty interesting fit. And again, I think it's a pretty interesting fit if you want to be discarding stuff, right? If you got a Bone Miser, you just start pitching stuff into your graveyard, you're getting lots of bonus off of discarding those cards, and your opponents have to start putting their hands on top of their library. I think that's a pretty neat fit in a lot of decks. Very interesting card. Lastly today, though, we have one of my personal favorites and one that I've been trying to make work in a deck for a long time. Hecatomb. 1 black enchantment. When Hecatomb enters the battlefield, sacrifice Hecatomb unless you sacrifice 4 creatures. Whew, that's a lot. That's a pretty hefty price. However, the payoff I think is totally worth it. Tap an untapped swamp you control. Hecatomb deals 1 damage to any target. So what Hecatomb does is it turns all of your swamps into pingers. That's pretty darn good, right? This is obviously an incredibly unique, interesting effect, not just in black, but just in the game of Magic entirely, turning your lands into pingers, right? Where does this card fit exactly? Well, I'll first say I tried to make it work in my A Name Is One deck. And the reason why I tried to make it work in that deck is because I have Urborg in that deck. And not only do I have Urborg, but the deck is built very much around getting Urborg into play for various reasons. So if I have Urborg, now all my lands are swamps, so that means I can tap any of my lands to deal damage. Pretty great fit there. However, I found the sacrifice 4 creatures thing was a little bit too difficult because I have a lot of big creatures in there that I don't really want to be sacrificing a whole lot. So I ended up taking it out of that deck. Where I think it's a really good fit though, again, works with the Urborg, but in a mono black deck, of course, again, pretty much all your lands are going to be swamps. So if you're in any mono black deck that is in a sacrifice theme already and you got a bunch of tokens lying around, right? The other deck that I used to have this in, I no longer have the deck anymore, was my Nadir and Miyara deck, my mono black elves deck, because of course Nadir is creating a whole bunch of tokens. I also could sacrifice my Nadir because he has that leaves the battlefield ability, so it was a sacrifice theme all around where it worked. But also, if my Nadir dies, I get all of those elf tokens, and now I can very easily use 4 of those to sacrifice to my Hecatomb when I want to put it in play. So I actually think this is a really good fit in any mono black deck or even a 2-color deck where you have a lot of token creatures lying around that you can very easily sacrifice. I'm actually surprised this doesn't see more play in the format. It's just such a fun, interesting card, and I think it actually fits in a lot of decks. But that is it for today. Just some crazy, wacky black enchantments that I'm sure a lot of people haven't heard of. I'm sure a lot of these cards are pretty expensive because they are pretty old. It is unfortunate. It would be nice to see some of these really interesting cards for Commander get reprinted in sets. Nevertheless, if you are thinking of purchasing any of these cards, I have a TCG Player link. It is in the description below. Feel free to give it a click. It helps support the channel. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.